Hey everyone, I hope you all are doing well. Our today's lecture on the origins of totalitarianism by Hannah Arendt is important not mainly because we need to understand how a totalitarian regime works and how it functions, and as something that has happened in the distant past, and that was a creation of somewhat exceptional conditions in the early 20th century. But we need to understand totalitarianism and the functioning of totalitarian regime because when you read this book, you will have the feeling that contemporary times are actually very much relevant and to some extent similar to those conditions that created totalitarian regimes and totalitarian movements in the early 20th century Europe. So, in a way, what I'm trying to say is that although it's a theoretical work that Hannah Arendt did, by analyzing history in chronicle order, by tracing some of the events that caused anti Semitism or imperialism, and on their advanced stage, totalitarianism. But those events were not exclusively limited to those times. You will get this sense, you will get this understanding by reading Hannah Arendt that societies and regimes are constantly vulnerable to fall into the trap of a totalitarian movement and to become a prey to a totalitarian regime. At the moment, while I was reading some of the summaries of the origins of totalitarianism, I was having this impression that at the moment there are quite a few societies and states that are perhaps moving closer to totalitarianism. And totalitarianism, by its nature, is a phenomenon that does not only affect the particular society that fall into its trap, but its implications are broader and are beyond one particular society, as was the case of Italian fascism, German Nazism, again fascism, Bolshevik Revolution, and Stalin's totalitarian regime. If you follow these regimes, what you might find common, despite many differences in their internal working, And also there were a lot of other similarities as well, but the striking fact about these societies and states was that these movements had broader impact on human history collectively than on those particular societies who were part of those movements. That is why I think that it is important for us to understand totalitarian regimes and totalitarian movements, and at the same time get ready to confront in our own political lives some of the movements that can emerge as totalitarian in 21st century. And I have this strong impression that generally what we have also been discussing in our class, the emergence of right-wing populism, particularly in Europe and generally in other parts of the world, it shows how similar these right-wing populist movements are and how similar conditions they share with one another to create a truly 20th century totalitarian movement that might end up in accelerating the process of giving power to our totalitarian regime. So generally, there are many similarities in the conditions that have created totalitarian regimes in the 20th century and right-wing populism in the 21st century in Western Europe particularly, but generally in other parts of the world. And secondly, my impression was that some of the societies and states have already fallen into the trap of totalitarianism. And what we see today, some regimes as merely right-wing populist regimes, if you look at the literature on totalitarianism, particularly the writings of Hannah Arendt and her analysis of the events, historical events that took place uh, before the emergence of totalitarian regimes, you will find a lot of similarities in some of the regimes that exist today and the totalitarian regimes that emerged after the First World War or in the first half of 20th century. And I mean to say that in my understanding, there are two countries that one which, which has already fallen into the trap and other that is moving towards that totalitarianism or totalitarian trap. And the first one that I talk about is India, that I think is already in the hands of totalitarian regime. And the movement that followed to this regime shares a lot of similar situation to what the situation of a totalitarian regime was in 20th century. In some cases, it's more lethal than the fascist regime of Italy and the fascist Nazi regime of Germany. And the second society that I believe is already in motion, what Hannah Arendt calls a constant motion mania, a motion mania in which somehow the impression of the participant is that they are strongly part of that movement. But once that is over, everyone finds it irrelevant to be part of that movement. And that country, which I think is already in that motion mania, is United States. The United States, which we have studied as the first modern democratic regime. Hannah Arendt also, in her analysis of totalitarianism, she also argues how totalitarianism has actually revealed two important yet very dangerous aspects of democracy. One is the fact that most of the totalitarian regimes, they follow the democratic path and then take on to democracy itself for destroying it. But there are two other aspects that are important that totalitarianism or totalitarian regime reveals of democracy. First, although democracy is government of the majority, yet the fact is that majority of the people do not follow the politics actively. There is only a small minority that follows politics actively. And that makes democracy somewhat vulnerable to fall into the hands of few people who can create a totalitarian movement. Secondly, contrary to the popular belief, the masses in democratic society are neither neutral nor consequential and could be harnessed for the furtherance of totalitarian ideologies. There are some other aspects of democracy that a totalitarian regime rather exposes. But Hannah Arendt does not believe that democracy is the cause or is the reason of totalitarianism, particularly in context of Europe. She argues that totalitarianism was rather the result of a societal change and the emergence of a classless society in Europe that gave birth to a movement which was totalitarian in its nature. So, this lecture, I would like you to emphasize on this point. This lecture is not only to understand totalitarianism as a form of regime that existed 100 years ago in the early 20th century and was the result of particular conditions and circumstances, but to understand it as something that is happening and that will continue to happen. Although I personally do not believe in making predictions, but if we depend on the analysis of Hannah Arendt of the historical events, the characteristics of a totalitarian movement, and the functioning of a totalitarian regime, we might actually end up predicting that some of the states and some states that are very close to our own state are actually already in a totalitarian phase, and they are already functioning as totalitarian regimes, and the implications of that regime being totalitarian, functioning as totalitarian, are actually broader than its own society, broader than its own borders. And the current crisis might actually accelerate that process of moving towards totalitarianism, because it causes what Hannah Arendt calls the atomization of individuals. It causes that atomization or atomization, making individuals as atoms, transforming them into isolated individuals. There is also another aspect that I find quite dangerous in our modern lives, and that is the aspect of social media and how social media actually is creating the atomization of society, which in the end is resulting into helping totalitarian regimes. So these are the important aspects of uh, totalitarianism that I want to discuss in this lecture. And I'm sure that in coming week, once we will have our online discussion, we will explore many other aspects of totalitarian regimes that are actually existing right now in some of the societies. And totalitarianism is actually the reality of our times. So that will be our point of discussion in this lecture. And I will try my best to explain to you first what a totalitarian movement is and how it starts, and what are the institutions, especially societal and cultural institutions and economic institutions that are involved in creating a totalitarian movement, how then that movement captures the power in any of the societies, especially the societies that are most vulnerable one, and how then that totalitarian regime functions and works in atomizing the society, converting the individuals into masses, and in governing all aspects of their social, political, and economic lives. And in the analysis part, I will try to relate the movements, totalitarian movements of 20th century to the right-wing populist movements of 21st century, particularly in Europe, but generally all around the world.